warm welcome to St Mary's Church for the annual Palm Friday service to commemorate the life of Sir Samuel Mico. A very special welcome to the Lord Lieutenant of Dorset, Angus Campbell, how do you say your surname? Campbell Esquire, the Chair of Dorset Council, Councillor Valerie Val-Porcathry. Good morning, thank you. The Mayor of Weymouth, Councillor Colin Huckle, the Town Clerk, the Mayors of Chickerell and Portland, the Freemen and Aldermen of Weymouth and Portland, the Trustees, and of course the beneficiaries, along with other invited guests.
Good morning. The charity founded by Sir Samuel Mico, what we now call the Mico Trust, began more than 350 years ago. You don't want me droning on about ancient history, but I would like to see if we can get some insight into what Sir Samuel did so long ago and why it's still important to us here in Weymouth today. A few years before Sir Samuel founded his charity, England was in the throes of the Civil War. This had started because the King, Charles I, was determined that the country should not be run by the representatives of the people in Parliament. When you think of some of the blockheads who get into Parliament, Charles might have had a point, except that what he really wanted was to be able to do whatever he pleased and spend as much as he liked at the expense of his subjects. The country was in a state of terror for 9 years as the Royalist and Parliamentary armies, the Cavaliers and the Roundheads, fought against one another. And the borough of Weymouth and Melcombe Regis was in the thick of it as the opposing sides fought for control. Initially, Melcombe was in the hands of the parliamentary side, under the control of Colonel Sydenham, known as the Governor, who lived in what we still call Governor's Lane, just around the back. But Wyke, and especially Portland, favoured the King, and fighting raged to and fro across the harbour, with devastating cannon fire from each side of the water and from ships in the bay. The fighting was vicious. And after one particularly bloody battle, it was reported that the harbour was full of bodies. A large Royalist army captured Melcombe, but Sydenham fought back and regained control with a brilliant operation around the old Weymouth Town Hall in High Street. Such a triumph that a public Thanksgiving ceremony was held in London. So far, so good, at least for the parliamentary side. But the Civil War left the borough and its people in a dire state. Many houses and other buildings had been shot to pieces or burnt down or collapsed. The quays along the harbour and the single bridge across it were badly damaged. The harbour itself was full of wreckage. Women had lost their husbands, men their wives, and children their parents. On the television news, we see something like this every day from Ukraine. So we have a vivid picture of what our hometown was like all those years ago. This all happened while Sir Samuel Mico was building his trading empire. So it's not surprising that he decided to do something to help. And what he did was of the most practical kind. he made a bequest to help young people with their education and training, and to support old sailors who could no longer earn a living because the harbour was wrecked. And that is what the Mico Trust still does today. Thank you.
On behalf of all the trustees, to say thank you firstly to the Lord Lieutenant, the Chair of Dorset Council, the Town Mayor of Weymouth, and Mayors of Chickerell and Portland, the Town Clerk and the Honorary Freeman and Alderman for joining us here today to help us mark Sir Samuel Mico's continued support for the young people of Weymouth. Some 357 years since he set it down in writing on the 25th of September 1665. Yes, a very precise date. And of course, 356 years after he actually died in 1666. I'm conscious that some of the aldermen and freemen may have actually been here many times before over their civic history in the area. Some of them will have been mayors and processed in as mayors, so it's nice that they are here with us today. And it's also nice to welcome some of our former trustees as well as representatives of local schools and colleges and organisations like FGP, where we support apprentices, and of course Budmouth College, where today we are joined by our new scholarship students that were only interviewed yesterday and awarded a scholarship. So thank you very much for coming along today. Of course, trustees would also like to thank the Reverend Joe Hayne and Matt for leading our service today, and for Paul for playing. I'd also like to mention somebody who's not here today, and somebody who has been with us in spirit, I guess, for certainly all of my 32 years involved with the Trust, and someone that probably doesn't get thought about, but I'm going to ask you to look up to my right to Sir Samuel Mico's crest, and you may notice to the right of it is a laurel wreath. Well, for the last 30 years plus, a lady called Fiona Penny has made that wreath and quietly crept into the church and placed it there. We know it's at least 30 years. I spoke to her yesterday. She actually started doing it before then for another local business, and she tells me each year it becomes quite difficult tracking down the laurels to make the wreath, but it does actually look rather splendid there today. So make sure if you come back in future years that you always look up to check that the laurel wreath is there. After the service today, we obviously invite all of you to join us at the George Inn on the Quay for refreshments, and we particularly want to hear from all the young people and what they have been doing or what they plan to do in the future. We will process in nice fashion down through the streets behind the maces, which you can see placed on the altar. And the maces again are quite significant because they actually come from the exact time of Sir Samuel Mico, so it's nice to have that historic link with us here today. Now, I'm not going to say too much else. I'm going to invite two people to speak just to give a flavour of what the Trust is doing and has been done. And the first is Ethan Gear, who's one of our recipients. So Ethan, if you'd like to come up, I'm going to put Ethan's little presentation that he's done up. And then after that, Robert Cole from Weymouth College is going to say a few words.
I'd like to thank Gary as well as all of the trustees for their continued support, as well as the invite to speak here today. I've got just about 5 minutes. I'm very briefly going to introduce myself and then talk through my experiences with the Trust. So first things first, I'm a student. I study in Southampton, and I'm in my final year. I study PPE, which I think, to the surprise of many, will not be the study of face masks and other forms of protective equipment. Instead, I spend my time reading about politics, philosophy and economics. A lot of my work concerns the interactions between those subjects, and most importantly, I've been a beneficiary of the Sir Samuel Mico charity on 2 separate occasions. The first of which was in 2019. If you can cast your minds back to that pre-COVID era, I was able to fly out to Canada, and I spent essentially a whole summer working with young children. I was responsible for groups of children for about a week or 2 at a time, and during those times, we would go and do fun stuff like this. I think this is one of our afternoon activities. We would also go on out trips once a week to off-site locations, canoeing, swimming, all sorts of fun stuff. Quite frankly, if I didn't have the additional support from the charity, I think this opportunity would have been very hard to access. Anybody that's taken part in something like this, or knows somebody that's taken part in something like this, will know that there are costs involved. I had to pay for my own flights. I was very fortunate to have help from my parents with that as well. The Sir Samuel Mico Trust helped with some of the costs for the fees of the course as well to get placed at a camp. These are some of my fellow British compatriots that I met whilst I was out there. I think this opportunity was really good for me because at a young age I was exposed to all sorts of different cultures and nationalities. I think it's really important to do that at a young age if you get the opportunity. You get to understand how other people think and work. For that, I'm very grateful. Now, the second occasion was a lot more recent. Just in the September just gone, I applied again because I was entering my final year of university, the year where it all counts, essentially. I'm writing my dissertation as we speak, and so to have to worry about money as well as all of my academic obligations is quite difficult. Once again, the Sir Samuel Mico charity came through. They provided funds, and I've been able to buy books and a new laptop as well, which I'm using to write my dissertation on. I won't bore people about buying books and a laptop and pens, etc., because quite frankly, I think there are more important things to talk about. So, just as I finish, I'm going to try and talk about some of the things that I study and tie it back to why we're here today, because I think that's possible. I read about issues like global poverty, trying to understand the economic implications of such an issue, and maybe how our moral obligations affect that sort of thing. What do we owe the global poor? I've also read about climate change and this thing called distributive justice. What we're doing when we're talking about distributive justice is talking about maybe natural resources or opportunities or responsibilities and how we should fairly distribute those things. What is a just way to share about those responsibilities, maybe of solving climate change, for example? And where it really relates to why we're here today is because one of the words that gets thrown about in these conversations is the idea of equality, and I don't really have a stance on what level of equality might be right or wrong, and I'm not here to throw any contentious claims about what might be right or wrong about it, but nevertheless, one of the key things people talk about is this idea of equality of opportunity. That is to say that we think that it's probably a good thing that when people are born, they have a good sense or set of opportunities in front of them to access things, to be the best person they can be, and so on. I don't know whether equal opportunity is the right thing necessarily, but what I can definitely attest to is the fact that having an increased opportunity set, having the opportunity to go to Canada and to study as effectively as I can is really important to me. And it's going to help me become, well, I don't know about the best individual, but it's really going to help me progress as I grow older. I think I can attest to that, and any other beneficiary of the charity that is also sat in the crowd today can also attest to this fact. So Samuel Mico, since the 1600s, have been providing these opportunities to people, and for that, myself and the beneficiaries are always so grateful. That's it.
Now, Rob Cole is going to talk to us for a few minutes now from Weymouth College, where we actually do something quite different than the sorts of things that we have done with Ethan and some of the other beneficiaries. And this is with some of our children that perhaps would have fallen out of education if we hadn't helped them. So I'll invite Rob to come up and say a few words.
Privileged to work with a number of students at Weymouth College, but also previously one of the local secondary schools in Weymouth, where I've seen first-hand positive impact of the Mico Trust and ensuring student academic and vocational opportunities remain fully open. It's very much keeping those doors open, as Gary's alluded to a number of learners. The Trust Fund has and continues to support a number of students on a variety of courses at Weymouth College, including placements for 15 and 16-year-olds from local schools who may not be getting on. The Trust continues to play a key role with a number of other stakeholders for the wider benefit of the community and future employment to ensure these learners remain in education, employment or training. Weymouth College receives, and I'm very grateful for the support for these students, because it had a transformative effect on these students and their life chances going forward. And I'd just like to say, on behalf of the college and all the local schools, a thank you to trustees and colleagues for your continued support. Thank you.
And it's nice to see lots of former trustees. Derek, thank you for all your time as trustee. I know you're still a friend of the trust, you haven't gone, but there's something in there for you. It's quite heavy, it's not gold. And there's also a nice certificate with the seals of the trust on as well, to thank you for all your efforts as a trustee, and to let you know that you'll always be most welcome here every year.
Every year.
Thank you, Derek.
Thank you, Gary.
Terrific not to have a microphone, because you can stand in the middle of the stage and talk to people rather than hide behind. It's very nice equal, but rather than hide behind it. It is terrific. It's like breathing fresh air and seeing everybody again. 2 years, seems 3 or 4 years since we all got together. And it's so nice now to be clearing it. I know COVID's still around, but we just got to live with it and be able to shake people's hands, speak to them, and come to things like this. So I'm hugely honoured to come here. And it's always, I knew nothing about the Mico Trust when I became Lord Lieutenant, and slightly ashamed that I didn't actually, because it's such an impressive organisation. And though we were told that someone didn't want to go into history and bore people, I don't think history bores people at all. I think the history is hugely important in this, because generation upon generation of people have looked after this money for this splendid town. And that must be very rare. That's something that doesn't always happen. So I was looking up, every year I've done this in the past, I've looked up Sir Samuel again, just to remind myself. And he was when he was 36, he was about the richest man in London. He was on the rich list, and that was before the Civil War. The Civil War must have knocked trade anyway. He did operate always, I think, with his ships out of Weymouth. Weymouth was a very important harbour then anyway. But the fact that it was 3 apprentices he was going to support, and it was 10 decayed seamen. And a decayed seaman is a seaman who's probably worked for him and lasted till he was age 60, because they didn't get any money until they actually last till 60. Well, very few people actually did last till 60. And the fact that people were lasting, going across what was a very much bigger world then in wooden ships and coming back, they certainly deserved some support. But clearly he had a civil conscience. He wanted to look after the people who'd looked after him, and he did it. But the extraordinary thing is, that £500, which is probably a huge amount of money today, I don't know how much that translates into, but the people here and the generations before them have looked after that money. And okay, we don't have many decayed seamen hanging about now, we've got national health, etc. But we do have a lot of young people who need a lot of support. And it's an amazing the amount of money that this has turned into, and the amount of support that young people get. And it's terrific to hear their stories. Wonderful. So I must say, I take my hat off to generation upon generation, and obviously including this generation of people who've looked after that money and looked after the people here. And I'm really, really honoured to be here today. So thank you. I don't mind this then.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Stuart MacLeod. I'm one of the trustees of the charity. When I became a trustee 5 or 6 years ago, I found that there were many questions about Sir Samuel Mico that I just could not find anything about. There was a certain amount of information on the website, and that was about it. So I decided that my role to help the charity was going to be to try and find out more about Sir Samuel Mico. And today, I'd just like to focus just on a tiny segment of his life, because if I told you how much I actually have found out, we could be here for some time. So, we're going to focus just on the very end of his life. Because in your orders of service, on the inside page, my good lady this morning, Sharon, found out that it says that we don't know the date of Sir Samuel Mico's death. Well, we do. We've found that out in the last few years. So, just a few slides just to show you something about the end, towards the end of his life. Thank you. Oh, it's me, isn't it? I thought I had an able assistant. So, Sir Samuel wrote his will on the 25th of September 1665, and this is actually what it looks like. And the good thing is, for any of you interested in history, it's actually written in English. So that's a bonus, because when you look back during those times, most of them are written in Latin, and it's a real problem. But I do know that some adherents of Latin will be able to work out things, but you can see, in the name of God, Amen. And that's what the wills of those days usually started out with. So it got me thinking, if he wrote his will on that 25th of September, what was going on? Where was he? What was happening in his world? And what we know is that on the 25th of September 1665, he was in London. He wasn't here at that point. He spent his time moving between Weymouth and London, but on that day, he was actually in London. So we know where he was at a certain time. But what was going on in London on that time? Well, unfortunately, London was in the middle of the Great Plague. It was a bubonic plague. And this was a sheet that the authorities in London published each week. They would have what was called a Bill of Mortality. And this is just the week before he wrote his will. So this is the 12th to the 19th of September, and this is what was happening in London. And what it says, I've got one of these wonderful gadgets. 6,544 people in London in that week died of the plague. If you think about the population of London in those days was about 100,000, nearly a quarter to a third, maybe some people have said up to a half of London died because of the plague. And Sir Samuel was living in the middle of that. One person died of cancer on that list. One person died of grief. 128 people died due to their teeth. And these are all the lists of how they calculated how the people died. And there's the biggest one there, 6,544 people. Over on the right side here is a list of the parishes of where people lived. And Sir Samuel in September 1665 lived in the parish of St Andrew under Shaft, which comes from the name of the place where the Maypole used to be held in London. And what it says for St Andrew under Shaft is that in that parish alone, in that week, 25 people died altogether. Nobody died because of their teeth, nobody died because of grief, but 22 of the 25 died because of the plague. So it was a dangerous place to be for Sir Samuel. And it's hardly a surprise then that he decided to write his will, because everybody was doing it. And this is some prints made at the time. This print here shows two dead ladies in the streets, and there's a child suckling at the breast of one of the dead mothers. And this one here shows the bell being rung and people coming out at night to gather up the dead and take them to the huge mass grave pits, one of them being at Blackheath. So it made me think that Sir Samuel was living during a time of a great epidemic, and we have as well. We've missed 2 years of doing this service, and we believe that those are the only 2 years since 1666 that we haven't held our services. So we've lived through something similar to what Sir Samuel was living through himself. We have been fortunate that we have had vaccinations. But what was happening in 1665 to get you out of the plague and rescue you? Well, this was the Wonder Cure. And I've got a packet of it here. I don't know if any of the young people would recognise what this is. Anyone? Nutmeg. This was supposedly the wonder cure of the 1660s. This was going to get you free of the plague. And for those of you who don't know what it is, it's a spice, and it comes from, well, in those days, it only came from one particular island in Indonesia. So you can imagine, if you controlled the spice for nutmeg, if you had that monopoly, which the Dutch East India Company held, you were going to make quite a profit during times of epidemic. And who would ever think of people making a profit during a time of a great epidemic? However, nutmeg was supposed to be the cure-all, and people would grind it and then put it into, grind it into powder and put it into their face masks, and they would inhale the powder. Some people got a little hallucinogenic by it, but hey, that got you through the plague. If you owned a pound of nutmeg in September 1665, it was said that you could buy a house with it, or a ship, which also would have been a good idea. So going back to the date of Sir Samuel's death, well, we know that he was buried on the 25th of May, 1666. And I was lucky, I was able to find this bizarre little document which says it's a record of monumental inscriptions in the Mercers Chapel belonging to the Company of Mercers, the Worshipful Company of Mercers in London. And I went up to the Worshipful Company of Mercers 2 days before the first lockdown. And with gay abandon, they said, yeah, come and look at all of our records. We have no idea when Sir Samuel died. And this was actually on the internet. And it was there, it had been there for years, an ancient document, and what it says just there in Latin, it says he died on May the 23rd, 1666. So there we go, we've got that. And then he's buried 2 days later. And this is the record that the Mercers Company do have, which says Sir Samuel Mico, Knight, Freeman, of the Worshipful Company of Mercers, London, was buried in the Mercers Chapel in the north aisle, within the screen door, near to the schoolhouse door, close to the end window, at the east end, on the 25th of May in 1666, which is great. And you think, right, well, we know exactly where he is, and the Mercers people, the assistants, took me to where they thought he was. Until the master of the Mercers came along and said, no. He was buried in the crypt. But unfortunately, the Great Fire of London came along a few months after he was buried, in September 1666, and the fire damaged many of the graves and the burial coffins underneath. So, in 1928, some workmen were doing some work in the Mercers Company, and they found these lead coffins down in the crypt of the Mercers Company. And on those were inscribed beautiful copper nameplates. And so I said, oh, well, that's great. Well, you will have all of those kept. No, because in 1941, a German bomb came along and destroyed the Mercers Chapel. So they were wrecked. And I said, so where is Sir Samuel? And they said, we don't know. In the 1950s, when the Mercers Company building was rebuilt, some workmen came and took the remains and took them to some grave sites in North London. And that's all we know. There was no record. However, through my persistence, I did manage to push the Mercers people a little bit further. And what they did find in their records was the last remaining name on one of those lead graves, And this is Sir Samuel Mico's wife, Dame Jane Mico, and she died in 1670, and we do know that she asked to be buried alongside her husband. So that was right next to Sir Samuel Mico in 1670, but that's where the story then ends for that bit. And the question that some young people have asked me was, did he die of plague? I think the assumption would be, no, he didn't, because he was buried at the Mercer's company. I don't think they would have wanted a plague victim buried right underneath them. So I think he died at a grand old age. We know for certain now he was born in 1608, and he lasted until 1666. And he didn't die of plague, he survived with ample amounts of nutmeg.
Describe myself. However, as vicar here at St Mary's, it's an honour to be able to speak to you this morning. And I wanted to start with a question. I wonder how many of you have been through times when life feels tough, when life feels a bit of a slog, when it feels like every day is just a bit hard work. Anyone associate with that, or is it just me? Yeah, there's a few nods. Well, and I'm not talking about the big things. Now, sometimes we do things that we know are going to be hard work, don't we? When recently I graduated for my master's degree, which is where I get to wear this funny hood, and I knew that when I wrote my master's dissertation, I knew that that would be hard work. But sometimes we go through phases in our life when every day feels like hard work, when the little things feel like hard work, when ordinary life just feels a bit tough. And I think we all go through those times, little seasons where it feels like you're walking through treacle. Well, in the story that Reverend Matt read from the Bible, we hear about ordinary men going about their ordinary, everyday life. And on this particular night, or this particular morning, they had been up all night, they had been working, they were fishermen. They were making their living on the water, much like many people who fish in Weymouth do. They'd been fishing all night long, and they'd caught absolutely nothing. They were tired, they were probably a bit fed up, and they're back on shore washing their nets. And then this man, Jesus, shows up. He's a teacher, and they probably would have heard rumours about this teacher. And people seem to love listening to Jesus. They love listening to him teaching. And as they wash their nets, people start crowding around Jesus because they want to listen to what he has to say. And so Jesus climbs into one of the fishermen's boats, and he asks Simon, the owner of the boat, to take him out a little way from shore, just so that he can stop being overwhelmed by the crowd of people around him, and then more people can hear him. Now, if I was Simon Peter, tired, fed up from a long and unsuccessful night, I'm not sure how tolerant I would be at this request. I think I'd want to wash my nets and go home. But Simon Peter obliges. He takes his boat out, and then he sits in his boat and listens to Jesus, the teacher, speaking to the crowd. And then Jesus says something strange. He tells Simon to go out to where it's really deep and put down the nets again for a catch. And Simon responds, Master, we've worked all night and we haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down my nets. Simon decides to place his trust in this teacher, and against all odds, something miraculous happens. And they catch so many fish that their nets begin to break, and they have to call on other fishermen to come and help. In this everyday routine, something they would have been doing day after day in their job, God shows up in the person of Jesus Christ, and he changes the ordinary into something extraordinary. And Simon Peter knows this, and he responds by falling to his knees. And this time when he speaks to Jesus, he doesn't call him Master, he calls him Lord. He knows that he's in the presence of the Lord. And from that day, Simon Peter's life is transformed. He leaves everything that he has to follow Jesus. And he becomes one of Jesus's closest friends, one of the 12 disciples. This story gives us a glimpse of how I believe God works. We can think that God is only at work in the lives of those who are super religious. We can think that God is only at work in the lives of those with a massive, strong faith. But this story shows us that God works in the ordinary situations. He works in our everyday lives. He works when we're tired. He works when we're a bit fed up. He works when things aren't always going to plan or as we expect them to. And God even works if our faith isn't huge. Simon Peter didn't start by calling Jesus Lord. He called him Master. But he placed a small amount of faith in Jesus. And when he did that, something amazing happened. And then he realised, and he called him Lord. The invitation to Simon Peter was to cast the nets into deep water. And this is an invitation that remains open to each one of us here today. God invites each one of you into a deep relationship with him. And if we're willing to place a small amount of faith in God, even if we're not totally sure that we would call him Lord, he can and he will do miraculous things in our lives. So Samuel Mico wanted to invest in the lives of young people because he wanted, I'm sure, for ordinary people to be given the opportunity to do amazing things. And Sir Samuel also insisted that each year you would come to St Mary's Church and hear a sermon by a good divine. And I can't help but think Sir Samuel knew that alongside the practical investment in your future that he was offering, he also wanted you to know that if you place a little faith in God, whether that's today, tomorrow, in years to come, if you place a little faith in God, he can and will do extraordinary things through your lives. Amen.
Yeah, check with that. I said, go in the thing.
Thank you.
Got to spend it wisely.
This not spending.
Or you could invest them.
These are all the stars from yesterday. Absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.